Welcome to Aging Insights. I'm Melissa Chalker, Deputy Director of the New Jersey Foundation for Aging. The Foundation's mission is to enable seniors to live with independence and dignity in their communities. Aging Insights is produced by the New Jersey Foundation for Aging to provide information and resources to boomers, seniors, and caregivers. The primary focus being to share important information and connect people to community-based programs. I'm sure many of our viewers have heard of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but how many of us truly know what it entails and what rights it protects? Today we're going to talk all about the history of the ADA and what protections it offers persons with disabilities. Here to inform us are two guests from the Northeast ADA Center, Joe Zesski and Jennifer Lynn Perry. So thank you both for joining me today, and I think this is going to be really informative for our guests because, as I said, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which we informally kind of refer to as acronym ADA, right, is something that has been around. Joe, you're going to give us a little bit of history on, but I understand it's the 27th anniversary of the law, is that correct?
Yes, it's last July 26th. 1990 when it was signed into law, so now it's 27 years, and it goes fast. But when you think about it with some of the time of other laws, like the civil rights law, it's still newer, but now time is marching on.
It
so.
sure is. Yes, it is. And so can you explain a little bit to folks what the Northeast ADA Center is?
Absolutely. Well, we're a center that is part of a larger network called the ADA National Network. We're one of 10 centers around the country that provide information, technical assistance, training about the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also some other disability-related issues and laws, but our primary focus is the ADA. Our center, the Northeast ADA, serves New Jersey, New York, and also Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, which some people might think is a little bit odd, but when it was set up, the centers, that's how it was designated by the Department of Education back when.
Yeah.
Now, we're not a part of the government in any way. We're funded by the government, and there's a mandate in the ADA to provide technical information to the public. And that is partly where our grant funding is motivated from. We serve all sectors of the public. So we have an 800 number that people can call. It's free, confidential. People can call and ask questions about the ADA or about really any disability-related question. And our bread and butter is the ADA, but we try to give folks information about whatever their questions or concerns are, and we try to explain what their rights are in a situation. But we also hear a lot from businesses, from architects, from government agencies, state and local government agencies, nonprofits. So we hear from all different types and sectors of the public, and we train, as I said, on the ADA, and that's done by people reaching out to us, calling us, asking us to come train their organization or business.
And that training is so that their staff understands the ADA and what rights people have under it, correct?
Exactly, typically.
And how to accommodate individuals, right?
Right, exactly. And a lot of times people have a very specific thing that they might want to know more about, like, oh, well, how do we better serve customers who might have a disability? Or how do we make our business more physically accessible? So there's a lot of different aspects to the ADA that can cover a lot of different topics, different areas.
Right. So we're going to get into some of the things that the ADA covers, but if you could just, I guess, give people a brief history of exactly what we say when we talk about the ADA. What do we mean? What is it?
Well, it is, first and foremost, a civil rights law, and sometimes people who aren't familiar with it get a little confused, and they think it's actually like a government agency, like Social Security or something like that. It's not. It's just a law. And so it is a law that was passed in 1990. And before that, in our country, there had been some other disability legislation that had been passed. For example, there was something called the Rehabilitation Act in 1973. But that law only applied to agencies receiving federal financial assistance. What's really notable about the ADA is that it was the first legislation that was really meant to be very broad and encompass a lot of things. President George Bush at the time, said it was the world's first comprehensive declaration of equality for people with disabilities. And that is true in the fact that the ADA didn't just apply to places that receive federal money, but it applies to employment, it applies to state and local government, to businesses, all different aspects of community living. And in the progress leading up to the passage of the ADA, there was a lot of advocacy by individuals with disabilities, because traditionally the word disability has, for a long time, had a very negative connotation in our culture. And when people think about disability, you know, they might think of, when they say, what's the first thing you think of? They might think of, well, it has to be someone who uses a wheelchair, or it has to be someone who's using a white cane, you know, very tangible things. And yes, those things are part of an experience of disability, but there's so much more to it and so many different varieties and shades of disability. And so all these different folks with various disabilities really advocated together and began to make positive change. They also began to work with both sides of the political aisle, if you will. The ADA was very much a bipartisan bill with supports from both Democrats and Republicans. And it also involved all different sectors of the community. I mentioned how it applies to employers and businesses. Those individuals, a lot of those organizations were involved in the discussions leading to the writing and formation of the ADA. And so all that collaborative work culminated in 1990 with the passage of the ADA. And since then, the law has been in effect for 27 years. It had what was called an amendment, the ADA Amendments Act in 2008. And now that amendment was to clear up some confusion that had developed over time regarding the original law, the ADA, and Supreme Court interpretations had, particularly in employment, narrowed some of the understanding of disability. And many employment issues began to really focus on, well, does this person have a disability, rather than was this person being discriminated against? The Amendments Act sought to redress that and say the original intention of the ADA was that its definition of disability was meant to be very broad and comprehensive and protect the rights, so that the focus in future court decisions would be more on not does this person have a disability, but rather was there discrimination in this particular case. And so the Amendments Act was passed to address those concerns, and that happened in 2008.
Yeah. That is a really comprehensive explanation. Thank you for that, because I think, you know, one of the things I did want to make sure we talk about is that when we say a person with a disability, oftentimes people think immediately of something you can physically see, like your example of a wheelchair. So when we talk about the ADA, we're not just talking about someone in a wheelchair, and we're not just talking about access to a ramp, we're talking about a much broader definition, and it's less about the type of disability and more about whether the person has been accommodated due to their needs.
It is. And the ADA, like anything else, it has its own definition for disability. It's based on what they call more of a functional understanding. In other words, how someone's ability to do things are impacted. And the technical definition is a physical or mental impairment, which is pretty straightforward, that substantially limits a major life activity, a record of that, or being regarded as having that. The last two parts, the record of, is if someone had a disability in the past that's not affecting them now. So let's say, for example, someone had breast cancer in the past and they had treatment. It's in remission. It's not currently impacting their life in any noticeable way, but they still have a record of that. So that is clearly now considered a disability. Someone can also be treated as if they have a disability, even though they don't. And that's where the regarded as part comes in that I talked about. For example, let's say someone had like a facial disfigurement of some kind, and they worked in a retail store, and their manager said, well, we can't have you work at the front counter because customers won't want to come serve you. even though that person doesn't have something that's impacting a major life activity for them, they're being treated as if they do. So that's where that regarded as part comes in. It's being treated differently based on the perception that you have a disability, even though you might not.
Right. In that case, you know, someone, it wasn't affecting their ability to do their job, but the person who was employing them was making it affect their ability to do their job.
Exactly.
Right. So I think that's a great example for people to understand what it is that you mean in terms of that protection. So can you give us an idea? I mean, this is a federal law, but can you give us an idea of maybe the number of people in New Jersey who might be impacted by this?
Absolutely. There's a large section. Now, New Jersey runs a little bit smaller than the national average in the different surveys that people look at. Roughly 1 in 5 people have some form of a disability. In New Jersey, it's a little bit lower. It's about 10% for the overall population. So if you think we have about 8.8 million people in New Jersey, roughly, it affects about 900,000 folks in New Jersey. The most common disability type, if you will, or category we have are ones that affect mobility, the way people are able to get around. That could be issues with their knees. It could be someone who does use a wheelchair. It could be someone also who might have another condition that affects how far or how long they can walk for. So the least common are visual impairments, and that's not just people who have no vision, but it's also folks who have low vision. So maybe they can't read standard print anymore, or they can only see things in their peripheral vision, or vice versa. So there are all different types of visual disabilities too.
Great. I think it's important for people to understand that even though we're talking about a federal law, this does apply to people in New Jersey who need also those same protections. And it's good to know how we compare to the federal stats. So I appreciate you breaking that down for us. And so, Jennifer, I want to switch to you for a minute just because, Joe's done a great job of explaining to us what the ADA is. And much of that has to do with people being accommodated in public life. So I think we're going to talk a little bit about what people can expect, and we'll talk about the structure of buildings and different things. And that's, I think, what most people think of. As Joe said, most people think of a disability as someone who's using a wheelchair or other type of way to get around. And so we think ramps, we think special parking spots. But what can you really tell us a broader sense of what we're talking about when we talk about public access and the ADA?
Absolutely, and I think Joe touched on this as well. The ADA really is quite comprehensive, a very comprehensive civil rights law, and it protects the rights of people with disabilities in so many areas. The international symbol of accessibility that's referenced in the ADA is an individual using a wheelchair. So I think that's led to some people not quite understanding that the law is much broader than just ramps and accessible toilet rooms. So in public life, for instance, the Title II of the ADA applies specifically to state and local governments. And what that really means for most people is that anything that's really funded through your state or local tax dollars has to be accessible to people with disabilities. So that would include things like any programs that are offered within your community, your public libraries, your public schools, public transportation, any events that are hosted, even through something like a Parks and Recreation Department. Those have to be equally accessible to people with disabilities as they are to all individuals. And then Title III of the law really applies to places of business. In the law, they're called places of public accommodation. So what that really means is that if you go to the grocery store or out to dinner with your family, or if you go to the ballpark to see a game, all of these things, or the movies even, all of these places have to be, again, accessible to people with disabilities.
Right. And again, that means, when we talk about government buildings, or if we talk about stores and other public places, they have to have a way for people who have physical limitations to get in. So again, we're talking basic things like parking spots and ramps. But what are maybe some examples of some other things that they would have to accommodate that people don't immediately think of?
Certainly. In addition to the architectural features, there's also this ongoing obligation to reasonably modify any of your policies or your procedures. So that might mean you might have to do something a little bit differently than how you normally do it to support, for instance, a customer with a disability. So for an individual who may be blind or have low vision, perhaps reading the menu menu to them if they come into your restaurant. That would be a reasonable accommodation for somebody with a disability. If somebody's in a grocery store and they can't retrieve a soup can that's located too high, a reasonable accommodation would be to assist in retrieving that kind of merchandise. So it's not just about the architectural features, while they're important, it's also about thinking about how you provide your services and your goods to the public, and how can we modify what we normally do to benefit someone with a disability.
And so you've been very great in clearly defining for us that this is part of the law affects government buildings and part of it affects other public places like grocery stores, and restaurants, which are great examples. But I was surprised in our conversation to learn that it doesn't necessarily include all types of housing. Is that correct? Can you explain that a little bit?
Because the ADA is specifically, it's applicable to places that have state and local government funding. If there was an instance where housing received financial assistance from a state or local government, something like a municipal housing authority, or perhaps a college campus might have a dormitory, because there's state funding involved there might be some application of the ADA in a housing context. But typically, if you think of most private apartment complexes, privately built condominiums, they are actually required to be accessible under another law, not the ADA, but a companion law, if you will. It's called it's another federal law similar to the ADA called the Fair Housing Act. So there are still protections in place for people with disabilities in that type of setting. It's just not under the ADA.
I think that's an important distinction for folks to know what the protections are, and that the ADA covers certain things, but where it doesn't, this other law picks up in terms of housing. So if someone was building a high-rise apartment building, that they would, the fair housing law does indicate that they need to make some accommodations.
Yes,
correct,
it does.
In terms of
and even
accessibility.
in addition to these federal laws, in terms of physical accessibility, the building code that's enforceable here in New Jersey also has requirements for accessibility that either meet or exceed what the Fair Housing Act requires. So there's several layers, if you will, of protection, particularly in new construction and alterations, to ensure that people with disabilities have access to things like apartments.
And this is, I think, again, really helpful for people to understand the distinctions that the law has and what is mandated under it. And so when we talk about accommodations needing to be made or buildings needing to be accessible, this is something, the law is more of a complaint driven. Is that correct? I think that's the way the wording you used when you described it to me before, in that this is something that if you're not being accommodated, you can make a complaint, but there isn't any necessary approval that a new building needs to get in their plans of making. They don't need to prove that they're building something that can accommodate someone with a disability, but if they're not, then someone could make a complaint. Is that?
That's very true. Yes, the ADA is very much what we call a complaint-driven law, meaning ultimately when we talk about the physical accessibility requirements especially, generally the United States Department of Justice, and specifically the Office of Civil Rights within the Department of Justice, has the enforcement authority there. But the Department of Justice doesn't come out and do plan review or site inspections of every building that's built. That would not even be manageable. But even though they're not doing those inspections, the expectation is that building owners and architects and engineers are complying with these requirements. So while there might not be, a local set of eyes inspecting every building, there is still this obligation. If a member of the public feels as though someone has violated the ADA and built something that's inaccessible, then they do have a right to file a complaint, and that complaint generally can go directly to the Department of Justice.
Okay, and how would someone go about initiating that?
You can go to, the Department of Justice actually has an ADA website, and it's very easy to remember. It's www.ada.gov, G-O-V, and once you go there, right on their homepage, there's a link to file an online ADA complaint. And you can complete that, and it gets submitted to the Department of Justice.
Right. And again, this is because it's a federal law, and so you need to go to the federal government level to get that complaint addressed rather than calling a local authority here in New Jersey, correct?
Exactly.
And I think that's a great segue to talk about, because we've talked a lot about physical accommodations. So, ways that people need to be accommodated to physically access a space, or even as you gave the example of reading a menu if someone has a vision impairment. But there are other things too that we have learned need to be accessible to folks, and one of those things is the internet, correct? There is this whole web accessible issue, and can you explain a little bit of what maybe the expectations are there in terms of that accessibility? I think Joe, you're the web expert, are you not?
Yeah, sure. I'd be glad to answer that. Well, it's a little bit in flux at the moment. I think there is definitely expectation from the Department of Justice, who does the enforcement for what are called Titles 2 and 3. That's the public entities, state and local government, and businesses. They expect websites to be accessible, and where it gets a little sticky sometimes is that they haven't published official standards of what to use. Now, actions that they've taken, what they call enforcement actions, which are things where they reach settlement agreements with different businesses about complaints, or they try to resolve an issue between disputing parties. They have used a particular standard. I won't go into detail, but it's called WCAG 2.0. And it's a standard so that people using different forms of technology can interact with the web, and the user may have different abilities. So whether someone is using a desktop computer or someone is using their cell phone, using a mobile phone, the accessibility standards are meant to provide equal access, or at least as much equivalent access as possible for people with disabilities, without. And while there are many different types of disabilities, some of the more common ones that people think of with the internet are either a physical one. Someone may have trouble moving a mouse, and so they might have a supplemental device that that moves the cursor. Or someone might have a visual impairment where they won't use a mouse, but they'll use like a tab key, if you will, if they're using a desktop. So a lot of the idea behind web accessibility standards are that people are able to use a web page in different ways and get as much access out of it as possible. And so that's been a pretty consistent stance by the Department of Justice using this WCAG, and we've seen a lot recently regarding some grocery stores in other parts of the country, as well as a lot of businesses. For example, Carnival Cruises had to make their website more compliant. That's a large company that people would recognize. And there are others too that are in the process of making their websites more accessible and reaching for that standard.
And I'm sure there's always going to be changes as technology changes and develops, but it's kind of like a bonus because it changes, and so you need to update what the standards are, but at the same time, because of all the great technology we have, there are newer and better ways for people to access the internet that might have a disability.
There are,
right?
and there's so many different ways too, with cell phones becoming more common, and a lot of cell phones now having features in them that can make them more accessible for folks out of the box. There's ways to magnify your screen if you have trouble seeing. For people who have no vision, there's a screen reader. There are features to adjust how sensitive a phone is if you have trouble with your hands, keeping your hands steady, to click on items. They're all different little tools like that that are becoming, I think, more and more common that are helping folks to access things through technology, which is so important in a time when so much is moving towards digital world in a lot of ways.
Yeah, that's why it's so amazing to me that the more we develop technology, there are ways that we need to improve it and make it available and accessible for all, but the same technology is making it easier for people to access the internet and to do things through their phone, which I think is crucial. So are there any other things that you think people need to know about the ADA that we haven't touched on that they should really know this is something that you have a right to address?
Well, I think I would say, we started off saying this is the 27th anniversary of the ADA, and the ADA has evolved over time, and initially when all these advocacy organizations were in support of the passage of the ADA, many people were thinking about people with disabilities have a right to enter the building. 27 years later, now we're looking way beyond that. That was a baseline. We now have technical standards for accessibility for swimming pools and for golf courses and miniature golf courses and shooting facilities. We also have proposed standards for accessible medical diagnostic equipment. So if you're someone with a mobility disability and you go to the doctor, for many people, transferring to an examination table has been very difficult. So standards for that type of equipment, weight scales, mammography equipment is certainly just showing how the ADA has evolved and thinking much more forward than it was back in 1990.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point that, not only to get into the building, but once we get into the building, what are we there
to
for?
Effectively use it.
And to use the space. That's a great. Joe, did you want to make another point as well?
Yeah, I was just building on Jennifer's point that the ADA has evolved and there are new standards, but what's at core for the ADA is that it's about equal opportunity. It's not a law that provides a benefit like Social Security, like I talked about earlier. It's about equal access, equal opportunity. And so it does evolve a little bit. And even if you don't have a disability today, people should remember you might later on, as we naturally age. Everyone gets disabilities, mostly. I think just here in New Jersey, by the time people are in the 65 to 74 age, over 21% have a disability. And by the time we get to 75, we're almost up to 50%, about 48% of people. So disability is not something that, oh, well, if you're not born with it, you don't have. It's something that is just a part of life. And even though you may or may not have one today, odds are at some point during your life, you will have one, whether it's you're not going to hear so well, or you have trouble seeing, or you'll have diabetes, or any number of different things that happen. And so there are rights that are protected for you when you do have a disability.
I think that's a really great point, Joe, because I think the reason we wanted to inform people about this by having you on the show was to make sure that people were aware of what their rights are. And just because it's not affecting you now doesn't mean it won't in the future. So it's important to inform ourselves of these things. So I really appreciate the two of you taking the time to explain all that. And I want to remind people that they can call your 800 number if they have questions specifically about the ADA or another disability issue, that they can call and get advice from you folks, and that they can go to the ada.gov to file a complaint or to learn more information about the law as well, correct?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you both for taking the time to explain all of that to us. And thank you for sharing your time with us today and viewing the show. Aging Insights is produced by the New Jersey Foundation for Aging and is made possible by donations to the foundation. To become a sponsor for Aging Insights programs, please go to our website at www.njfoundationforaging.org or call us in the office at 609-421-0206. All of our previous shows may be viewed on our website. We'd like to remind you to find out about senior services in your area, please contact your County Office on Aging. Their numbers are also on our website, or you can call the state hotline at 1-877-222-3737. Thank you for watching this episode of Aging Insights, and remember, aging is everyone's business.